Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla TV, here to talk to you today about how to change the brakes on your motorcycle. So if you're watching this video, my guess is you fall into one of two camps. You might be the rider who has simply worn out their OEM brake pads and they're looking to replace them so you can continue stopping. That's a great reason to replace your brake pads. The smaller subgroup of you may be folks who have some life left in your pads still, or maybe you don't, doesn't really matter, but you're looking to change your brake pads mostly to get some different characteristics with respect to braking. You might be looking for something with a little more initial bite, or perhaps a pad that dusts a little less. Regardless, you're looking to change your braking experience, and both of those are great reasons in order to change up brake pads, experiment, and see what else is out there and how you can upgrade your factory ride. Now you can see here we're working on Buzzsaw's Tiger. It's a fairly late model motorcycle. Now this bike has disc brakes fairly obviously, and they are hydraulically operated. The process, however, of changing brakes is going to be pretty similar from motorcycle to motorcycle. If you're rocking a drum brake or something that's mechanically actuated, it is going to be a little bit different for you, but those are few and far between, so we're not really concentrating on those styles of brake right now. Now you can see this thing is equipped with a radial caliper. If you have conventional mount brakes, the process is very similar, but if you want extra deep analysis, swing over to our Common Tread article where we also did a brake job on a conventional mount brake system as well. Installation on these is really easy. Throwing new brake pads on your bike is a one bearder on our BSD, our Beard Scale of Difficulty. I'm going to call it a one bearder maybe plus a sideburn. I'll explain that in just a second. The actual tools you need are pretty minimal, just a couple of hand tools in order to get this job done. You don't need a lift at all. I've got Buzzsaw's bike up on the lift really just so you guys can see exactly what it is that I'm doing with my hands. Now the reason I mentioned that sideburn is that these are brakes. Even though this is mechanically simple, brakes are important. You need to stop. You should be confident in your ability to do a brake job. So if it's something that you're a little bit concerned about, have a buddy walk you through it. But if you've got some decent tools and you're confident that you know what you're doing when it comes to general mechanical knowledge, most people should be able to get a brake job done themselves with a minimum of effort, and you should feel pretty confident in your work. So let's get right to things. I'm going to describe the process a little bit, and then we'll start tearing this bike apart. What we're going to do is remove the actual caliper itself. Once we get the caliper off there, we're going to check out the condition of the pads, we're going to look at the condition of the rotors, and then we're going to clean everything up, just generally clean the parts, especially the ones we're going to be putting back into play. From there, we're going to lubricate a couple of important pieces. We're going to put the new pads in, we're going to bolt everything back up, and there we're pretty much complete. The job really is very simple. Now before we get started, a couple things I do want to warn you about. You'll notice I'm wearing these goofy gloves. Brake pad material is carcinogenic, so the dust that collects on your brakes, also carcinogenic. Protect yourself. Some of you may even elect to wear a respirator. The other thing I'm going to sort of clue you into too is because we're doing a brake job, this is a hydraulic system. So once you have this caliper off, it's really important you don't hit the brake lever or the brake pedal, depending on whether you're working with on the front or the rear of the motorcycle. So if that means you have to write yourself a big note or perhaps tell your roommate not to come in the garage, whatever it takes, make sure that once that caliper comes off the bike, you don't hit the brake pedal or the brake lever. It could be as serious as requiring a caliper rebuild, which is no fun, especially if you're trying to do just a quick brake job. So let's get cracking on things as of right now. The first thing I want to do is remove this caliper so that I can actually assess the condition of some of the stuff inside here, and we can see how Ed's brake system is actually doing on his bike. So I'm going to loosen up these bolts. As you can see here, I'm just going to back these out, spin them right out here, and then I'm going to move on to the upper bolt. And as I do this, I'm going to support the caliper, and the reason I'm going to do that is because these are the only two things holding the caliper to the motorcycle. So I'm going to spin these puppies loose and back these out, and I'll feel this start to loosen up. Now an item of note here, once you do actually get these loose, supporting the caliper can be important. This is a fairly light aluminum caliper on a very strong stainless line, so it'll be okay if this one hangs by the weight of the caliper. However, if you've got something a little different, if you've got, say, a big old shovel banana caliper hanging off of maybe a weak rubber line, you might want to think about supporting your caliper somehow once you get it off there. Whether that includes maybe a wooden block or a chock to set it on, or perhaps unbending a coat hanger and running it from above in order to suspend the caliper a little bit, you might want to think about possibly supporting it if you have a really heavy caliper on a fairly weak brake line. So as I slide this thing off, we're going to get a better look at the caliper itself here. Now as I back this off, I'm going to be careful not to bang it against the wheel, and that's a big concern for you sport bike guys who have big rotors. So once I have this thing off here, we can sort of see some of the componentry here. Now what I need to do in order to get all of the pieces out of here so we can start assessing things is to remove this caliper pin. This is going to be the piece that's probably most different from most riders. Not everybody's going to have one pin. Heck, you might not even be able to see your pin. Your bike might not even use a pin. However, use this again as sort of a rough guideline for how this process is going to work out for you. You should have your factory service manual open, and between that and watching me do this, you should have a rough idea of how this process is going to go. So I'm going to take a hook pick here, and the first thing I'm going to do is remove this little cotter pin that retains this should it back out. So I'm going to pop this puppy out of there and set that aside because we're going to reuse that. And then I'm going to back the pin out. So you'll notice I have my hand both above and below this. Sometimes these things can sort of explode once you start taking parts apart. If you don't have a factory service manual, now is an excellent time to take a picture or two, or maybe sketch out exactly how the parts are oriented if you're not sure. But again, I'm going to push you to have your factory service manual handy. That's really the best way to make sure you get things back together. So you can see this caliper pin's loosening right up here. I'm going to spin this out just a little farther. And some stuff, like I said, this might fly apart. I'm hoping it doesn't. We're going to give this a little yank. Okay, so we have the pin out now, and my hand is holding everything else together here. So I'm going to pull pieces out and kind of talk about them as I pull them out here. Now you'll notice right here, we're looking at the shim. All this does is provides a little bit of downward pressure. It keeps the pads from jiggling around inside of the caliper. We're going to reuse this, so we want to set this aside as well. Now you can see the pads are free. I'm going to slide these out the bottom, and we're going to talk about these for just a moment. So we'll let that caliper sit there. As I said, this is a pretty light caliper on a pretty strong brake line. We're okay to let that thing hang. Again, make sure that you're supporting yours if you do have a heavy one on a weak brake hose. So here are your actual pads themselves. So you can see here, as these have worn down, Ed's gotten some pretty good use out of these. Buzzsaw rides pretty hard, and he's gotten his money's worth out of these pads. There's a little bit of life left in them, but really these could probably stand to be replaced. So one of the things that's important as far as doing your brake job isn't just getting the new parts in there, but it's actually examining the old parts and making sure they're wearing correctly. One of the things I like to look at is fore to aft wear. So for instance, you can see this brake pad is actually worn pretty evenly fore to aft, and that's a good thing. It means it's not cocking in its bore. If you do notice some sort of a wear pattern like that that is tapered, that can indicate a few things. It might indicate improperly lubricated slide pins, but in this case, since there's only one pin, that wouldn't really be the issue. The other thing it might indicate too, though, is perhaps a set of caliper pistons that might be hanging up. You might have a piston that's hanging up somewhere, and only one piston in a multi-piston system is doing its job. So it is really important to examine that fore to aft wear. Another thing that's important too, though, is top to bottom wear, how this thing is wearing from the outside of the, the outer circumference of the brake into the center of it. Some of you may notice, again, that your pads could cock perhaps the other way too. Again, possibly due to improperly lubricated slide pins, or in a really bad scenario, if you've got a big ridge up at the top here of unused brake material, a lot of times that points to an improperly installed brake pad. If you see that, you should have your eagle eyes on and really be picky as you're pulling that thing apart to make sure everything was put together correctly. Odds are you're probably going to find a mistake. Just keep that in mind as you're assessing things. So in looking at both of these pads, they're actually in really good shape here. It looks like Ed's brake system is functioning normally as far as the hydraulics are concerned, and that's a great sign. The other thing we also want to check out, though, too, is the condition of the rotor itself. So this can be kind of important. Look at the surface of the rotor. You'll see this is nice and smooth. It looks really good. It's not glazed over, and there's also no deep scoring. If you happen to be doing brakes on your motorcycle because you heard a terrible noise like a ship scraping over the Great Barrier Reef, that's not good. What that probably was the metal backing plates digging into your rotors. It's an expensive sort of a thing. You're usually going to have to replace your rotor if that happened. The reason is that if you wear those scores, those deep grooves into this rotor, they can chew into your new pads. All you're going to do by replacing the pads is mask the symptom. You're not going to address the problem. Now, even if your rotors do look really good like buzzsaws do here with no deep scoring, we still need to measure them. The pads themselves, as they squeeze onto the rotor, scrub it away. They really just squeeze the thing until eventually the rotor wears down in thinness. So we're going to take a micrometer here and check the thickness really fast. Now, when you do this, you want to do it in a couple different places in order to determine the thickness and make sure that the rotor is actually good to go, both the inner and the outer, and at a couple places along the diameter of the rotor. This thing's in pretty good shape. So really, Ed's got some great wear going on here. His rotors aren't all ragged out. His hydraulics appear to be doing well. This is a perfect candidate for a new set of brake pads. So we're going to continue with the process. At this stage, what I like to do is start cleaning some things up. And I usually use a brake-specific cleaner in order to do that. Cleaning things up allows me to do several things. First, it allows you to more carefully assess the condition of the components. The other thing it lets you do is make sure that all the parts that we're going to be reusing, like the shim and the pin, they're going to have a nice clean surface from when we lubricate them. Rather than mushing the lubricant into this dirty lubricant dirt mess, we can clean them off, start with a fresh slate, and we're going to have nice clean lubricant hitting nice clean parts. So what I'm going to do here is spray things down. I'm going to spray the caliper down. Again, be careful with this stuff. This stuff is also not really that good for you. So put your gloves on, use your respirator if you have one. And one of the areas I want to pay special attention to, I'm going to turn this over so you can see, are actually the caliper pistons here. These are kind of important. So these are sealed really only with very delicate rubber seal. So it's important to get in here, get everything clean, because that brake dust on there can actually be kind of acidic, and it can wind up being abrasive as well. So this area especially is really important to get all cleaned up. I'm going to grab a rag here to sort of help assist me, making sure that I've gotten all the dirt and goop out of all the nooks and crannies on the caliper. That really is pretty important there. And again, just assess how things are looking. By cleaning things up, you should be exposing a little bit better to the condition of the parts that you're actually working on. So at this stage, we're pretty much ready to rock and roll. Now, the reason I clean before I start doing anything else, again, is because we're going to have to move these caliper pistons back into the bore. This is really important because Ed's pads were wearing down as he used them. They got thinner and thinner and thinner. So these pistons had to come out closer and closer to the center in order to make the pads contact the rotor. Well, these nice new pads are much thicker, but they're not going to fit in this same width space. So what we're going to do is drive these caliper pistons back into their bores. Now again, the cleaning sort of becomes important here. Because these pistons are now exposed and we're going to be shoving them back in there, we want them nice and clean. We're coming back in there. We don't want to drive all sorts of dirt and goo and just general road muck back into the caliper. So by having these clean, we've ensured that we're ready to rock and roll as far as the caliper piston withdrawal process. So I'm going to use my fingers to push these in. Usually I'm strong enough I can get them in there. So I'm going to try and cheat this towards you a little bit so you can actually see me driving these in. And you'll notice as you drive some in, some other ones might pop out, but eventually you should be able to work these all back into their bores. Now, if it turns out you're having trouble doing that, one of the things I like to do is grab the old pads and I will put them back into place and take a pry bar or a flathead screwdriver and use something to drive them carefully back in. So what we're doing here, what we're looking for, as you can see, I think I'm just about there, we're looking for these pistons to be more or less flush with the caliper body itself. I think we're about there right here. You can see, with the exception of that last piston, we're pretty much flush here. This is going to give us the room we need in order to get the pads back into the caliper and the whole assembly back up onto the bike. Now from here, what I need to do is lubricate some things before I start reinstalling. So let's get down to the workbench. I made a little bit of a mess here, but I'll show you some of the stuff I'm working on. So I'm going to start lubricating things. The first thing I want to talk about is the actual lubricant itself. You can't just use any old product here. You want to use a brake-specific lubricant. The one I'm using is actually silicone-based. Silicone's good stuff to use because, again, you've got rubber seals in the caliper there. Some of you who have slide pins for your caliper are going to have rubber boots protecting them. If you're using anything that's petroleum-based, it turns out that you can indeed tear up the rubber with a petroleum-based product. The two are not really compatible. So make sure that you're taking care of that. So I've cleaned up our caliper pin as well. I'm going to lubricate this. And you want a fair amount of lube in there, but don't go crazy. We want enough lube that's going to stay on there and it's going to survive a couple of wet days, but we also don't want so much on there that's being flung all over the place. So use your judgment, but again, a little bit of lube goes a pretty long way here. Now, the other place I like to lube too, and this might sound a little crazy, is actually the backs of the pads. So I'm going to put a little dollop on there. And the reason I like to do that is we're putting lubricant basically anywhere metal is moving against each other. So the pistons themselves hit the backs of the pads. A lot of times when people have brake noise they can't figure out, it's not actually the lining material that's hitting the rotors making noise. Sometimes it's actually the backing plates on the brakes actually making contact and sort of standing up and singing, if you will, with respect to the caliper piston. So what I like to do is throw them on there, and you'll notice I'm putting this stuff on here very, very thin layer. I like to liken it to buttering your toast or putting jelly on your toast in the morning. So I'm going to slide these carefully down here. Now, one of the other things you're going to see me do here is actually get rid of these gloves. And the reason I'm doing that is because I have lube on them. Now, as important as the lubricant is, we don't want to actually throw the lubricant onto any of the moving parts of the bike that have to do with the braking. We don't want the friction surface getting gooped up. We don't want the pads getting contaminated. We also don't want any of it hitting the rotor. So be sure to change gloves frequently and don't get that lube all over the place. There's only a few select spots we want to see lubricant. So as of right now, because I've got my caliper pistons driven back into the bore, I've got all my parts lubed up here, pretty much set to rock and roll, we're about ready to tackle the reinstallation process. So this part can get a little bit tricky because we're going to be putting a couple things in play at the same time. You might feel like you need 3 or 4 hands. I'm going to attack this right now. You guys are probably going to have a couple laughs at my expense because it does get a little bit hairy. So we're going to start loading the pads in one at a time. Again, being careful not to get lubricant all over the place. So we'll slide the first pad in. And this is also something I want to talk about. It's probably going to make a couple of you laugh, but it is really important. Pads are two-sided. There's a friction material and then a non-friction material side. If you put these in backwards and you put the backing plate up against the rotor, you're going to have a big problem. It's metal on metal. You're going to ruin your rotor and you're probably going to ruin your pad, and you may not stop in time. So pay really careful attention and make sure that the parts of the brake pad that are supposed to touch the rotor are actually oriented correctly. So I've got these pads in here, and I'm sort of holding them in with my hand. This might get, like I said, this might get a little bit tricky here. So now what I need to do is orient that shim clip back into place. So what this is going to do is basically keep downward tension on the pads so that they're not rattling around in here. So every time we hit a bump, we don't hear the pads rattling about. So we're going to install that puppy carefully in here. I'm probably blocking the camera just a bit, but we'll work that into place. So that's now in place. And from here, I need to slide my pin in. So this is where it gets just a little bit tricky. So kind of just a one piece at a time sort of thing. And I'm going to feed this in here, get past the first pad, which appears to be going well. We're going to go over the shim clip in order to keep that pinned in place. And then from here, we can get that last pad popped in. And after we work that in there, we're pretty much set to fly. We can now snug this puppy down. So let me grab my tool here. So at this stage, I'm going to tell you, you should be using your factory service manual. You should check out your factory torque spec, and you should use your torque wrench. Do as I say, not as I do. I've done a lot of brake jobs. I think Buzzsaw is fairly confident that I'm not going to send him careening into a school bus full of children. However, I'm going to encourage you to do things the right way. Don't cut any corners. Use your factory torque spec on here. So I now have this thing snugged down. One of the smaller things I'm going to make sure that I do is reattach that little cotter pin, the just-in-case cotter pin. We're going to slip that back into place. And from here, I really am just 2 bolts away from getting this ready to rock and roll. So it's important to have the pads spread. As I said, we have that nice big gap in there, and that's going to allow us to work the pads and caliper back over the rotor. Now this is in place. I'm going to reinstall both of the retaining bolts here. Same deal applies on these as with the other bolt. You really should be using your factory spec on these with a torque wrench. Sometimes, though, we break rules. I'm going to snug these down, swap out my socket here, and at this point we're really getting close to the end of the job. So I'm going to get these in place and tighten them up. Now, if you have a dual disc system like we're working on here, you're going to want to think about the other side. You don't want to do one set of these. It's okay to do fronts or your rear independent of each other. That's perfectly fine. But if you're working on an axle with multiple calipers, you want to make sure you service both of the calipers at the same time. That's pretty important. You're going to want to service those to make sure that, again, your braking performance is the same side to side. If your brakes are operating differently from each side, you can wind up with weird pulls or strange behavior. And the other thing to think about too is we're not just replacing the pads, we're also lubricating some pretty important parts here. So if one side is lubricated real well but the other side hasn't gotten any attention, you can notice a difference in performance from one caliper to the other. So we're all snugged down here on this thing. After we get that other side done, we're ready to rock and roll, except for one important step. Because we drove those caliper pistons back in, they're not really close to the pads right now. So if you grab a hold of the brake lever, you're going to notice it's going to sink right to the bars. You may actually have to grab several times to pump that back up and get those caliper pistons back to where they need to be. This is really important that you do this before you roll your bike out of the garage. It can be very disconcerting to go ripping down the road and have absolutely no brake power after 3 or 4 grabs of the lever. Make sure you do that. It's a really important step. So that about wraps up a brake job. It's the ZLA way of getting brakes on your motorcycle. If you want a little more information about this, about some of the pad options you have, and then also some tips and tricks that we didn't show you here in the video, scoot on over to the Common Tread article by clicking that info button. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to us, and you can drop a comment down below for some other riders if you have some sort of a tidbit that might help other people out and do a great job on their brakes. As always, I'm Lemmy. I'm out of here.